Hello, everybody. Welcome to episode 115 of ASBN Live. We're thrilled to have you here today for a special Earth Day presentation, Ensuring Global Peace Through Ecological Regeneration. I'm so happy that we have Sierra Flanigan, who's our Livable Planet Working Group co-chair, who set up this amazing session and brought together these wonderful speakers to talk to us about environmental regeneration and international conflict resolution. It's now my pleasure to hand it over to Sierra, who will introduce this lovely panel.
Thank you so much, Thelessie, and hello out there to all of you tuning in. My name is Sierra Flanigan, and I am co-chair of the ASBN Livable Planet Working Group. And in addition to monthly meetings, we plan quarterly town halls, forums like this that we think are timely and relevant, and when we want to talk about actionable collaboration that we can do moving forward. So as we started to think about what Earth Day, what we could focus on for Earth Day, we could not ignore what's happening in the world. We're all feeling it. It's very, very heavy. And how can we ensure that we're not looking at these issues in an isolated way? So I'm here with three outstanding humans. Kehkashan Basu is a human and environmental rights activist. She advocates for peace, children's rights, gender justice, climate justice, education through sustainable development, you name it, through the Green Hope Foundation. Absolutely amazing human. Monica Willard, my personal mentor, dear friend, who was also instrumental in putting together this panel. Monica has been awarded with the Spirit of the UN Award. She has been instrumental in integrating spirit and spirituality into various days of observance at the UN, as well as into the UN Development Goals, and has been organizing the International Day of Peace for many days in a row, or many years in a row. Finally, Jonathan Granoff is the president of the Global Security Institute. He's a lawyer, a human rights activist, a lecturer, screenwriter, visionary, a liaison for Nobel Peace Prize laureates, and working right before this call to get aid to Ukraine. So these are people who are really on the front lines of this work. And today we want to help illuminate the interconnectivity between international conflict resolution and environmental sustainability. We want to talk about how these systems intersect, where there's breakdown, what are some of these patterns, and what opportunities are emerging for business, for us as individuals to transform. So we want to inspire you and your respective organizations to really serve as agents for peace, democracy, and for business as it was originally intended. And we want to challenge you to get political and to uproot this notion that politics is inherently corrupt, because we need you in this fight. And most of all, we want to invite you into this process of healing the human spirit through your own experiences and relationships. So you'll see there is a Q&A box. You can plop your questions in there. But I'm going to first turn to Kehkashan, who is an entrepreneur. She founded Green Hope Foundation at the age of 11, right, Kehkashan? Advocating for children, climate, gender, all of these interrelated complex issues informing the Green Hope Foundation. So we've asked you, Kehkashan, to kind of paint a picture for us, maybe through sharing your story. What is the state of the world from your vantage point? How do all of these complex challenges interlink, and what opportunity are you seeing emerge in these complicated times?
Thank you, Sierra, and hello, everyone. Good afternoon from Toronto, Canada. I am very happy to be here today, sharing this virtual space with all of you on this very important topic. And since my work revolves around ensuring that the intersections of all our world challenges are addressed, I'm really glad that this kind of discussion is now entering into the mainstream so that everyone realizes how important it is for us to not address our world challenges using a silo-based approach, but actually recognize the interconnections. So I will start with telling you a little bit about myself and Green Hope Foundation and the work that we do before I really speak to the topic at hand today. So my journey in the field of sustainable development started 15 years ago at the age of 7 when I saw this image of a dead bird with its belly full of plastic. I realized immediately that there was something inherently wrong with our world for such an innocent creature to suffer through so much pain. I literally had sleepless nights thinking about the agony the bird must have experienced before it died. And that kind of prompted me to take action. It was also around that time I attended a lecture by environmentalist Robert Swan, and his words, "The greatest threat to our planet is the belief that someone else will save it," really resonated with me, which inspired me to plant my first tree on my 8th birthday. And it was then that I started looking deeper into what our world challenges were, because this dead bird with its belly full of plastic made me realize that there were surely other things that we as human beings had done wrong and were doing wrong, which was how I was introduced to the tremendous inequalities that exist in our world today. And when I was 9, just a year after the start of my journey, my parents told me about Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And in the beginning, I thought that maybe we human beings were smart and that we dismantled these weapons that literally destroyed generations. But no, I realized then that we still had nuclear weapons, and we had more weapons of mass destruction than ever before. Even though the numbers have gone down, it's still enough to wipe out our entire planet many times over. And when I started speaking to my friends about it, to other people, I realized that it was seen as a very taboo topic to talk about. And because nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction weren't talked about, the intersections of nuclear weapons with nuclear injustice and environmental injustice were also definitely not talked about. So when I founded Green Hope Foundation, it was to create a platform of learning that turns into action, that addresses all of the challenges our world faces, whether that is biodiversity loss, whether that is gender inequalities, whether that is poverty, whether that is nuclear weapons and nuclear disarmament, and addressing the interconnections amongst them. So we work in 26 countries with over 300,000 people to really make sure that we use education for sustainable development as a transformative tool to bring about a change in mindset so that learning and education turns into ground level action. One of our primary areas of work is to make sure that the money that goes towards building weapons of mass destruction is reallocated towards addressing our world's most pressing needs. And we do that through our own ground level activities, addressing exploitation and injustice everywhere, whether that's in the Rohingya refugee camps or Syrian refugee camps, homes for children of prisoners in Kenya, homes for HIV positive children in Nepal, and doing our own small bit to show everyone how this money can be used for the better. So that includes using clean energy infrastructure all around the world to build schools. We've actually built our first school just last month, to build sustainable agriculture systems, to provide solar streetlights to communities, to create safe spaces for women and girls, addressing gender equality through and inequalities through sustainable finance, sustainable farming, building deep-bore tube wells, even building toilets to really create this holistic, safe space for everyone, and also addressing and raising awareness about nuclear colonialism. And we do this through speaking at the highest levels of policy making, but more importantly, through nuclear disarmament education. We have a campaign called We Want Books, Not Nukes, where we really teach young people about the importance of first knowing about this veil of secrecy that exists in terms of nuclear weapons and what they can do in their own small bit to take action. and how having that education from a young age, when they grow older and come into positions of power, they won't make the same mistakes that some people of our past have made. And we do this using creative modes of communication like music, art, dance, drama, sport, eco-fashion, and writing to really make sure we're able to reach out to everyone and address this topic with children and young people, something that is very sensitive in a way that they're able to understand as well. Which brings me to our current scenario, where in just the past 8 weeks since Russia invaded Ukraine on 24th February, we have had 2 instances already of a superpower directly stating that it would not hesitate to use its nuclear arsenal. The latest utterance coming last week on 14th April, when Dmitry Medvedev, deputy chairman of Russia's Security Council, said that should Sweden and Finland join NATO, then Russia would have to strengthen its land, naval, and air forces in the Baltic Sea, and explicitly raised the nuclear threat by saying that there could be no more talk of a nuclear-free Baltic where Russia had its Kaliningrad enclave sandwiched between Poland and Lithuania. And if we are to believe, so sorry about that. If we are to believe the published data on stockpiles, then Russia really has the biggest arsenal of nuclear warheads. And along with China and the United States, it's one of the global leaders in the hypersonic missile technology. And while the world's focus has been riveted on Russia and on Europe, the rogue regime in North Korea continues to test missiles with abandon while its people starve. And just earlier this month, Kim Jong-un, the powerful sister of the North Korean leader, threatened South Korea with retaliation if provoked after Seoul highlighted its supposed preemptive strike capabilities against the North. And all the while, the threat of fissile material falling into the hands of terrorists continues to rise. So all of this put together, this puts humanity in a very precarious state where just one moment of madness could escalate into a full-blown nuclear war that could wipe out humanity. And coming at a time when the world is yet reeling from the throes of the 2-year pandemic that is still going on, that's killed millions, has pushed an even greater number into poverty and exploitation. The sheer injustice of this all really defies logic. How can we allow our leaders to exploit nationalist agendas and create a war situation that in turn accelerates weaponization when COVID has put 1.6 billion children out of school, majority of whom are girls and majority of whom may never return? And while global hunger is plumbing to new depths and the Ukraine crisis is set to foment a wheat crisis that would result in famine in the world's poorest nations, we already have 1 billion people, that's 1/8 of the world's population, going hungry. And there are tons of research that reiterate that conflict is the key driver to exacerbating the severe food crisis, including famine. And that's a fact that is officially recognized by the UN Security Council in May 2018. And we are seeing how hunger and undernutrition are much worse when conflicts are prolonged and institutions are weak, because not only are the number of crises and conflicts on the rise, they are now worsened by climate-related shocks. So how many more should suffer from these pangs of hunger so that the power-hungry despots can build more nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction? So it is these correlations that we as sane voices of society must establish and hold parliamentarians and corporates accountable to. We must counter the shroud of far-right nationalism and security with facts. We must expose the gross injustice that pervades each and every aspect of nuclear weaponization. And that, as I mentioned, is our mission at Green Hope Foundation, where we focus on engaging all voices to amplify the call for stopping this race of self-destruction. And through our work, we highlight the ongoing nuclear colonialism, the system of domination through which governments and corporations disproportionately target and devastate indigenous peoples and their lands to maintain the nuclear production process. And additionally, the entire cycle of nuclear weaponization from raw material sourcing to waste siting makes it the greatest perpetrator of environmental injustices of the modern era. So from cradle to the grave, it risks environmental injustices. And the danger lies in the fact that its impacts, despite affecting millions in the United States and elsewhere, it remains invisible in the public domain. And the Western media, when it chooses to, has access to data, but that is not the case in most other nuclear armed states. So we bring out the injustices that continue to prevail in other regions. For instance, in Jadagaoda, the uranium mining town in eastern India that has for decades been the source of India's yellow cake. And the deprivation of the indigenous people in Jadagaoda is unimaginable, but it never makes it to the news headlines. And it is this narrative that we're changing through our work on disarmament education to expose the vested interests that for decades have shrouded nuclear proliferation under the guise of nationalism, while hiding the real motive of profiteering. And if these nations were so concerned about the safety and security of their citizens, then why were they caught napping when COVID-19 hit us? Why didn't we have the security apparatus in place to combat and defeat this virus? So this insane race continues even today only because of the severe lack of awareness amongst others, amongst all stakeholders of civil society, amongst young people who are its largest stakeholders and whose future can be destroyed at the press of a button. And to conclude, that is why disarmament education is so critical. And this is our mantra at Green Hope Foundation: to engage and educate children, youth, vulnerable communities, indigenous people, and every stakeholder about its futility and the profligacy that characterizes weapons of mass destruction and nuclear weapons. This is not just an issue for scientists or erudite senior statesmen to debate and ponder upon. The bomb will kill everyone, young and old, so why should our voices be silent? We must mainstream it and combine it with movements that impact the future survival and well-being of humanity. For example, those of climate change, of gender justice, of racial justice. And the Ukraine crisis reflects all too well how perilously close we are to the Armageddon. And if we don't move now with speed, it may be too late. And ominous as it may sound, but we won't even be around to collect the fragments. So that is why it is so crucial for all of us to recognize the challenges that exist and then take urgent action to make sure that we are not literally signing all of our death warrants. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kehkashan. It's chilling to think about the unimaginable impact of nuclear war where nobody wins. But what we also saw in the midst of all of that was the Ukrainian spirit. And I think, as many of us have speculated, Russia thought that they were just going to come in and hijack the country, but that's not what happened. And Monica, you've always talked about the healing and the regeneration of the human spirit. And so I wonder, with that lens and that of spirituality, can you talk to us about what you're seeing in Ukraine and other war zones and places around the world? What's emerging and what's giving you hope in terms of the human spirit?
Thank you, Sierra. I so deeply appreciate being able to address the American Sustainable Business Network, because it is a network of people already committed to caring for our planet. It is a network of people who are engaged in the economy of keeping this planet sustainable. It isn't just profitable. We're talking about sustainability. We're talking about generations. And Kehkashan has painted a realistic picture of where we are, and it is a scary time. So I would like to share why I bring spirit into so many things, because I don't know what all the right answers are. None of us do, but every little bit does make a difference. So I would like to start by sharing the prayer of the thought, because it holds a connection between the environment, nuclear weapons, and our future. And Kehkashan, Jonathan, and I are part of a cooperation circle of the United Religions Initiative that brings people together on a monthly basis, frequently more often through working groups, to address the issue of voices for a world free of nuclear weapons. And one of the places we start each month is a prayer written by the founder, who is the Episcopal Bishop of the state of California. And he founded the United Religions Initiative, which brings people together in 113 countries with groups of interfaith, different beliefs, 3 different ways of looking at things, with a minimum of 7 and a maximum of, one of our cooperation circles has employees of over 100 people. So it's schools, it's people, it's communities, and building resilience. So I'm going to start with a nuclear prayer. The beginning and the end are in your hands, O Creator of the universe, and in our hands. You have placed the fate of this planet. We are attested by having both creative and destructive power in our free will. Turn to you in sober fear and intoxicating hope. We ask for your guidance and to share in your imagination and our deliberations about the use of nuclear force. Help us to lift the fog of atomic darkness that hovers so pervasively over our Earth, your Earth, so that soon all eyes may see life magnified by your pure light. Bless all of us who wait today for your presence, who dedicate ourselves to achieve your intended peace and rightful equilibrium on Earth, in the name of all that is holy and all that is hoped. Amen. And to me, that addresses so many issues and really solidifies the environmental side of it. And with Earth Day and our green thoughts, protecting our planet is not only a nice thing to do, we're at survival mode, environmentally and with war, and particularly with nuclear weapons. So I'm going to bring you back with a personal story, because everybody has their personal story along with our collective look towards the future. I started in looking at the nuclear arms race and was part of the million people on New York City streets in the 80s. But there was a project, and it was an art project. And a woman who was an embroiderer said, "How can I embroider when there are nuclear weapons?" And then she said, "Well, how can I not? This is a way that I can get everyone engaged in it." Kehkashan was talking about the importance of being able to address the taboo, to bring in all of the voices. And Justine Merritt asked people to put on cloth that which you could not bear to think of as lost forever in the event of a nuclear war. So I take this moment to ask each of you watching with us today, what would you put on a cloth panel, 3 feet by 1.5 feet, with ties on each corner, to tie your message, your hopes, dreams, and prayers? What would your personal message be? And as I ask you to think about it, I'm going to share you one. I don't know how much of this you can see, but this ribbon hung throughout the Earth Summit in 1992 in one of the tents that held many educational and spiritual events. This has been used at the United Nations in summits throughout the world, and it's usually my background at home, but I happen to be visiting a friend and I bring this to you, but it is the world. And it's the world with sparkles, with glitter, with water, with land. And it's the people, the monuments, the history, but the future. And that's why we are gathered here today. We have to plan for the future. And I am so excited to be addressing people who care so much about developing this sustainable business that is going to carry us through. There are unknowns. We don't have a roadmap, but we do have the Sustainable Development Goals. And it is an amazing roadmap for transformation, looking at the interconnection of so many things between education and hunger and no poverty and safer cities and safe energy and above land and below land. There are all these topics. But the Sustainable Development Goals leave out, even though peace is included, but it leaves out the impact of war. It leaves out measuring the impacts of so much of what is happening as we are building and allowing this whole culture of violence to be what permeates. We must recognize that when we kind of in the 80s went down in numbers of nuclear weapons, it didn't really decrease the effectiveness. As a matter of fact, with the way we develop things, each nuclear warhead is even more impactful. And yet, what is sane about mutually assured destruction? It doesn't work. It never worked. It isn't safe. But we have allowed us to take this false security. It is time to lift the fog of atomic darkness. Be aware of where our tax money is going, and we have to demand changes locally and in businesses. And on this Earth Day, I am just so excited about some of the projects that I have seen the environmental movement calling on insurance companies, on banks. We have even passed at the United Nations the treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons. And it causes us to look at the strain of money. And it makes it, it is so strong in many ways. And yet a treaty at the United Nations is only binding to those who sign on to it. And given the fact that no nuclear power state or those under the nuclear umbrella signed on to it, it gives it no impact in that body, and yet it states a financial goal. And the countries that did sign on to it and who passed this particular body need to be recognized. It isn't just our Security Council that should be allowed to set rules for the world. We live in a commonly shared environment. We share our water sources. We share so much. We have to work in new ways. And I count on the business group, particularly those dedicated to sustainability, to help us bring new inventions, capture the scientific minds that have been allowed to be used for destruction. We need a real regeneration in positive ways. And we also need to recognize that there are ways that we can stop spending our money. There are socially responsible funds. There are sourcing informations for every business to look at. And I just want to finish with looking at the Ukraine, because the Ukraine has opened our hearts and we are seeing the suffering. There is nothing that war does better than destroy the environment. It destroys the physical, it destroys the spiritual life of families in so many ways, just separating everyone. It isn't just nuclear weapons. It is the whole idea that war is acceptable. And so I invite all of us to lift the fog of atomic darkness, to hold the energy and spirit of the Ukrainian people in our hearts, to do everything we can on individual levels, but to take it as a collective responsibility that we need to plan for the future. Suicide is not something we can put on as something that's acceptable. Nuclear weapons are nothing but global suicide. We must change our status. And I ask all of you to look at this issue seriously and to not ignore it, and to do everything you can to make sure that your funding in particular is shifted away. And there are funds are already set up to do this. It doesn't take much to get into one. And I invite you to be as creative as possible to help bring us into a future that really is sustainable. Thank you, Sierra.
Oopsie. Thank you,
Yeah.
Monica. Really, really appreciate all of your words. And now we're gonna turn to Jonathan. And Jonathan, Monica mentioned the paradigm dilemma. I have a feeling you might want to touch on that as well. But how do we bring principles of peace into focus in ourselves, in our businesses, and in the global community?
Well, I want to honor the direction that these two brilliant women have set. I've been involved with the principle of the unacceptability of nuclear weapons since the 1960s, when I was interning in Washington for a congressman and was taken out to lunch with 4 or 5 other interns by the then senator from New York State, Robert Kennedy, who told us about the Cuban Missile Crisis and how close we came to ending civilization. We've since discovered that had the Defense Department's policy of trying to invade Cuba prevailed, that we wouldn't be here today because those weapons were operational and the field commanders had authority to launch had we invaded. And Senator Kennedy said that, and I'll never forget this, that the nuclear weapons issue is the moral and practical litmus test of modernity. I was deeply involved in lawyers' exchanges with the then Soviet Union lawyers when I practiced law. And then Senator Alan Cranston and Mikhail Gorbachev got a hold of me around the turn of the century and said we need to have an organization focused specifically on the abolition of nuclear weapons. And thus I ended up, they persuaded me to give up my law practice and become devoted to that issue. And I'm the president of the Global Security Institute, largely focused on the premise of Senator Cranston, which is nuclear weapons are unworthy of civilization. And the shining example of President Gorbachev, who with Ronald Reagan pledged to work to eliminate nuclear weapons. And I'm really pleased to be in a working group with Kehkashan and Monica that has the former Secretary of Defense, William Perry, whom we're giving the Alan Cranston Peace Award to at Stanford University next month. And former Secretary of State, George Shultz, who just passed away, was one of the founders of this group. So this is a call for conscience. This is a call for practicality. Based on the premise, by accident, design, or badness, these weapons will be used. Any use is morally and practically unacceptable. We now know that if less than 1% of the now approximately 13,000 nuclear weapons in the world were used, it would throw at least 5 million tons of soot into the stratosphere, ending the agricultural base upon which civilization rests. So we're moved from mutually assured destruction to what we now know is self-assured destruction. Joe Biden, when he ran for president, ran on a ticket where he pledged to reduce the salience of nuclear weapons and take America away from the threat of the first use of nuclear weapons to the sole purpose of nuclear weapons, that the sole purpose of nuclear weapons is defensive, to prevent them from being used. But that's not going to be the policy. That is not the policy. There's a thing called the Nuclear Posture Review. It's about to come out soon, and the Defense Department is running it, and the military contractors are powerful influence. And that is not going to change our policy. So we have a first use policy. It's not any different than Russia's. Russia's is the same. We only hear theirs. We don't hear in our media what our actual policy on the use of nuclear weapons is. Nor do we hear much debate about the $1.9 trillion pledged to fully modernize and upgrade our arsenal, make it more likely to be used. And of course, we set the pace for the rest of the world. Imagine that money being used for the quality of life in our country. We could eliminate poverty. We could protect the climate. Imagine almost $2 trillion committed with no real debate, except for maybe Senator Markey, Senator Warren, a couple of senators have raised the issue, but there isn't a political constituency supporting them. And in the Ukraine crisis, here we have a country that has made it clear that if you threaten to use nuclear weapons, all of the international mechanisms of enforcement of the norms of law, international humanitarian law prohibiting the use of weapons directed to civilians, is stymied by the threat of total annihilation of civilization. And that's what Vladimir Putin has put into play. But he's put it into play because he believes that his country is threatened by those same devices. Why does he believe that? Because we have deployments that make it clear that we're willing and able to use them. We have deployments in Poland of so-called missile defense systems that we put into place allegedly to protect us against Iran. Romania is the same, and those deployments could easily be changed into offensive deployments. So what would we do in the United States if such deployments were put in place in Mexico or Canada or Cuba or Venezuela? I totally agree with Kehkashan. We are in a course of madness. And if you, I posted an article I wrote called The Process of Zero that catalogs several of the near misses, like Secretary Perry. One of the reasons he's so passionate about eliminating nuclear weapons, and I urge you to go to his website, the William Perry Project, former Secretary of Defense of the United States, in which he was awakened in the middle of the night because it looked like there was a full-scale launch against us, but it was a computer chip era. Similar things happened with Russia and the Soviet Union. As after the Cold War, there was a weather satellite launched off the coast of Norway, and it appeared to be a nuclear launch. And Boris Yeltsin had 8 minutes to decide whether to use his arsenal before it got hit, before the command and control of Moscow over the system was destroyed. And he said the only reason that he didn't believe that he was under threat was because he didn't see any reason why Bill Clinton would do that. There was no crisis. We're in a crisis now. And such a mistaken situation could lead to the end of us all. What was the mistake? Mistake was the Norwegians had told the Russians that they were sending off this weather satellite, but it didn't get passed up the command and control. A simple human error. We can't make devices more secure and perfect than we are. And yet we're depending on these creations we've made. But why? Why? What is driving this madness such that the more we perfect the technology in the pursuit of security, the less security we obtain? Why are we spending almost $2 trillion a year in the world on military expenditures and a pittance on the Sustainable Development Goals? It's because we have a paradigm of the pursuit of security that's fundamentally flawed. It came out of another era. It's a 17th century horse and buggy road that was created in 1648 in Westphalia to stop the Protestants and Catholics from destroying Europe. Portions of Europe had up to a third of the population decimated in the argument as to whose definition of Jesus' love was better. And there were a bunch of wonks got together and said, we have an idea, let's make nation states. That's the basis of the nation state system, which is based on the premise of national boundaries and sovereignty, which has now evolved over time into a definition of security based on a Roman adage, prepare for war, receive peace, prepare for peace, receive war, peace through strength. And it reached its articulation in practice in the 20th century with 2 world wars. And in order to resolve that and ensure that it wouldn't happen again, the UN system was created, but it's an insufficient system because it's based on the concepts of that 17th century horse and buggy road. National militarism is the main way in which security is pursued. But today, as we speak, we know that there is no such thing as national security in an insecure world. Pandemics don't carry passports. The climate does not recognize national boundaries. As we breathe, 50 to 70% of our oxygen comes from phytoplankton that depends on the health of the oceans. And trust me, the oceans don't recognize national boundaries, nor does our third lung of that phytoplankton or the rainforests upon which we depend. And so many other issues, biodiversity. We depend on the web of life. So we need a new paradigm, a more realistic paradigm to approach security. Well, I'm pleased to share with you that the nations of the world, the diplomats, not the military guys, not the military contractors, not the nationalists, not the religious fanatics, not the racial fanatics, not the tribal fanatics in different ways, but the diplomats have at the UN said we need a human security paradigm. What is that? That says the first duty of the state is to protect its citizens, and that can't be done without a global perspective because these threats that we face are of a global nature. So I'm pleased to share that one of the organizations that I'm a trustee and a fellow in, the World Academy of Arts and Science and the Global Security Institute, are in the process of partnering with the United Nations to mainstream human security. Human security is based on the realism that we have to use science to define our relationship to the natural world and the fundamental dignity of every individual embodied in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The idea that the legitimacy of the government comes from those who are governed, and the rule of law, which these are all threatened by the authoritarian aspects that we're seeing in the United States, in which we have a political party that is rejected. It is not about a big lie. It's about a rejection of the court decisions of 60 courts. It's a rejection of the rule of law. And that's precisely what we see in Russia, a rejection of the rule of law, which gives power to the people. We're all equal under the eyes of the law. And I come to the point of the power of an idea, the power of ought. The United States is based on the power of ought. Thomas Jefferson's, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. Hardly self-evident when he stated it, and not self-evident today to many people. Didn't include women when he said it, didn't include men without property, didn't include people without property. They weren't even citizens. It didn't include people of color, didn't include indigenous people. It was very limited. But he put the ought out there, and that has become the lodestar, the North Star of political legitimacy. Even dictators pay the price of hypocrisy. It is a compelling, transformative idea in human evolution. And today we need the idea of human security as a paradigm shift from military nationalism, as a North Star in the chaos that we're facing today. So I am going to say right now, because I have authority to do this, that we want very much, and by we, I mean the World Academy of Arts and Science and the Global Security Institute, to partner with your organization to mainstream the concept of human security. Now, it's interesting, the business community has the rule of law in business contracts that came about after the Cold War through the arbitration system. In any of your international contracts, whether it be for finance or goods and services, there's a clause articulating how disputes will be resolved. And it's almost always arbitration. You're not relying on the state court systems. You're not relying on local judges. And those adjudications in the realm of arbitration are honored everywhere in the world. You can have a letter of credit in Kuala Lumpur, honor it in Santiago, Chile. You can have a judgment in New York and have it honored. Well, I don't know if it's going to be honored in Russia right now, but it was just a few months ago. The point being, that the administration of global governance in the business community, allowing for globalization in trade, commerce, and finance has happened. We know it can be done, but we don't have governance in peace and security. We don't have cooperation there. And we don't have the administration of justice and human rights or environmental protection. What was conceived of as a common good has now become a market good. Justice globally is a market good. That has to change because we have to protect the environment, not only for the moral imperative, but it's a practical necessity. And I'm going to end with this point that what the wise since time immemorial have told us, the reality of the spiritual harmony of the human family. In the Upanishads, ancient Hindu scripture, and it's actually over the Parliament of India, says the world is one family. We now know, as a practical matter, that the world is one family. So we're at a moment in the evolution of human beings in which this spiritual admonition to see the human family as one has become a practical necessity. And that is the principle embodied in the human security paradigm that brings together all of the sustainable development goals, which are so siloed. They're siloed in how they get funded. They're siloed in their programs, when in fact they're integrated. Just like Kehkashan pointed out, that there's an integrating of geostrategic security with children's education. These issues can no longer be separated, and we need to change, and we need to change fast. And the wake-up call for the world is in Ukraine, where these values are being fought out. I'm not suggesting that overnight we're going to have this, but you need to have a North Star. You need to have a compass point of where we need to go. That is what is compelling and what is missing. That's what America brought to the world, is the principle of the equality of the citizen and the rule of law. And it's at risk in our country. So this is a global threat that we're seeing in the Ukraine between authoritarian models and freedom, equality, the rule of law. But it's also an issue in our country, in the United States. And it's on us to be clear on what is the North Star. And the North Star is human security. That's the first duty of the state. And it's not a diminution of sovereignty to ratify the law of the sea and protect the deep seabed, common heritage of mankind. Fulfill the promises in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty that we're a party to negotiate the elimination of nuclear weapons. Simply live up to our promises and live up to what we know is good and right. The metrics for doing this are not found in management by objective. If those were applied to Socrates, he would have been a complete failure. Jesus would have been a complete failure. Buddha would have been a complete failure. Ideas and principles have power. So I believe that this is the time for the ought of human security to take a foreground in our deliberations and discussions. And that brings together all of the programs of virtue that I see in your organization, but more importantly, that we see the nations of the world committing to, and that's the change that has to happen. In the meantime, yeah, we need weapons in Ukraine to fight in self-defense. We need nations, but not as ends in themselves. So I ask everybody, here's a nice to do, because I know Sierra said, what's a good to do? Here it is. One of the hats I wear is I'm the senior advisor to and the representative to the UN of the World Summit of Nobel Peace Laureates. So each year, except in the pandemic for the last 15 years, the Nobel Peace Laureates have gotten together and had a summit. Like we had one in Colombia to try and help stop the war, the civil war there. We had, in any case, we have these summits and all the Nobel Peace Laureates come together. And one of them, we produced a statement for the citizens of the world to do something, which was to ask every political leader and ourselves, what are you doing to eliminate poverty? Because we now know that we can do that for the minimum percentage of the military expenditures. 2, what are you doing to protect the climate? And of course, that involves economic transformation. What are you doing to eliminate nuclear weapons? Not Should we eliminate nuclear weapons? Should we protect the climate? Should we get rid of poverty? But ask every political candidate, what are you doing to obtain these goals? And I would add one, to ask ourselves in our short period of life together here, what am I doing to find the highest love within myself, the highest virtue, the highest goodness within my heart, and bring it into action today? What am I doing to do that? I think these questions are transformative, and I thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to share with you.
Thank you, Jonathan. And that's a perfect segue into our final round of questions. And actually, it's come up in the Q&A, which is, we talked about some big systemic issues here and some very dangerous potential scenarios. It can feel a little hopeless. And I think folks on the call really want to know, what can they do as individuals to cultivate peace within their hearts? What can they do to be an agent for peace in their businesses? We all have a role to play in this. Can you, Kehkashan, maybe we can start with you if you could just take a couple minutes to name what are specific things that people some actions that they might incorporate into their life this Earth Day to be agents for peace.
Well, thank you for that question. And I am a strong advocate of the belief that every single person can bring about change, and that individual action is very powerful, because when we put all of our individual actions together, we have collective action that brings about global change. The main thing that I would say is educating yourself, educating your community, educating your family. That is the one thing that every single person can do, no matter where you are. As someone who works at the grassroots across 26 countries, I recognize that the challenges that are facing our world today, while they are global, they have sometimes very localized and unique impacts. And therefore, it is impossible for just one person to say that this is what you have to do in order to become a good citizen. It's not about that, but educating yourself, knowing about the issues is definitely a first step. And then you bring your experience to the table. And peace starts from within. Really, it's about that empathy for being at peace with yourself, empathy for people and planet, which is something that all of us can cultivate slowly and steadily, but really with the urgent action that's now needed. It's important for all of us to kind of rise up to that challenge. And we at Green Hope Foundation, we address peace through various pillars, for instance, through energy, through education, through access to clean water and sanitation, food, and equality. And these 5 pillars, and addressing these 5 pillars, we create peaceful societies, and at the same time raise awareness about how the money is going towards building weapons of mass destruction rather than focusing on just these 5 pillars, for instance. So there is a lot that can be done, and especially to address these security concerns, contacting your local representative, your MPs, reaching out to those in positions of power, even running for office. I mean, what better way to change the system than, running for office yourself and making sure that no one else makes the same mistakes of the past. So there's a lot that can be done, and those are just a few things that from my side I'd like to give out.
Well, you're a huge inspiration for all of us, Kehkashan. So Monica, what about you? What are ways that people, businesses can begin to integrate principles of peace into their lives?
Well, I want to start by us going back to Kehkashan's wonderful picture of the bird and the plastics. And I know New Jersey has just banned plastic bags. And there's a lot of, this is a change. We have to change. And what might seem like a little change, when you put them all together, is a big change. We have to take plastics out of the cycle. We have to be aware of what we are using, what we are doing, and that there are limits. There are limits on what we need to have and to make safe things. Start using glass containers instead of Ziploc bags. I mean, little changes will make a big difference. And when people stop buying plastic bags, or when you start carrying a cloth bag and using things, those might seem very small, but we are making some changes in our choices. For many people, making choices to eat less meat, making choices to not run water wastefully. I mean, there are so many environmental choices, but if we incorporate a few things into our life in a very serious manner, we think differently. And as somebody who advocates the International Day of Peace throughout the year, you cannot go out of your way to pick fights. Our words matter. Our thoughts matter. Our intentions matter. Our actions matter. And so that personal commitment to living more in peace with yourself and particularly with Mother Nature. And I do have to say, I want to just be proselytizing for a minute. Jane Goodall's newest book, Hope, the Book of Hope, a survival guide for trying times. Just carrying this book and reading it made a difference to me. Now, not only does she mention the International Day of Peace many times because she is a messenger of peace, but just her lifestyle, her love of animals, and particularly for an Earth Day, very committed group of business people. I just invite you for your businesses to truly reflect the highest ethical standards in how you do your accounting, where you get your materials, how you treat your employees. We make a difference in our daily life, in our family life, in our community, in our organizations. And it was a pleasure to be here with you today to celebrate Earth Day and to know that the link between peace and environmental protection and our planet for the future are inextricable. We have seen what war is doing. We must stop it, and we must prevent any kind of a nuclear exchange before it happens. So I just have to end with what I always end with, whether it's a prayer for grace, whether it's a meeting. The prayer I use all the time is, may peace prevail on earth.
And Jonathan, do you have another call to action to squeeze in a minute or so?
Well, somebody wants to see specific policy issues, and I don't, at every level of society, the principle of love people and use things is a good guiding principle. Never love things and use people. We have to shift our governing principles from things to taking care of people. And what are the tools that we have for that? Well, it depends on what level you're talking about. So a person asked me, Barbara Brown asks about whether, I don't know if she was being snarky here, whether we're advocating that people in the Ukraine surrender. Of course not. Of course not. There is a value for weapons for self-defense. There is a value for militaries. But militaries don't set policy. They don't set the compass point for progress for humans. They're a last resort. They only arise when there's a failure of human qualities and law. So we need to strengthen those institutions, create compulsory jurisdiction in the International Criminal Court to hold tyrants accountable. The United States hasn't ratified it. We haven't even ratified the treaty on the rights of the Convention on the Rights of Children, because the fanatics on the right say it'll diminish parental control over the ability to, it'll violate spare the rod, spoil the child in the Proverbs, that punishment should be in the hands of parents to beat up their kids. How absurd. We haven't ratified the Convention on the Law of the Sea to protect the deep seabed because it contains within it a duty to be responsible to future generations. Because part of the absolute ownership of property or loving things is the ability to destroy things. You can destroy your house. You don't have to give it to your kids. That's part of property, and people want to own the global commons. So, I mean, if we want to start talking policy issues, I want to talk about principles so that each of the people listening can think through what are the principles that guide my behavior. And I would say loving people using things is a really good principle. And one of the things we have is ideas. Ideas matter. Ideas are things we create in order to accomplish things. The idea of the state is a convention, an idea that we've created. The idea of the planet is an idea, because we actually live in infinity, and you can't have an idea of infinity. We actually live in a miraculous gift of life far beyond our intellectual comprehension. But we have the capacity to have moral choice. And we have to bring that into the daily lives of our institutions. So if you want a simple way of looking at criteria of what's a good policy, Sierra, you wanted a principle? Mahatma Gandhi laid it out really nicely. He said, if you want to know what have a policy analysis, think of the most disempowered, poorest person you've ever met, and think, is this policy a burden or a blessing to them? You know, that's exactly what Jesus said in Matthew. I was hungry, did you feed me? I was naked, did you clothe me? What you do to the least amongst you, you do to me. So to look at a policy, does it burden the least amongst us, or does it help liberate them and free them? That's a good way of looking at a policy. But if we want to talk, specific policies, my policy is this, and I've learned this from my own direct experience. When I invigorate within my heart the highest virtue that I have been gifted by the thing that gives me conscience, and make it my intention to fulfill that highest virtue, opportunities seem to arise in the organization of the universe to fulfill that intention. That's my experience. So I suggest that, Barbara, that you do an experiment. Tomorrow, treat everybody as if you don't care about them, as if they're just a means to fulfill your most selfish ends. You have absolutely no caring for their well-being or happiness. And then imagine how you would feel at the end of the day. Now imagine if the next day you treat everybody in every institution you're in as part of your family, with the same dignity that you have within yourself, with the same caring and love as you treat your immediate family, and that you bring the highest love that you have within yourself into action, that you provide goods and services in whatever profession or enterprise you're involved in that's going to help enhance life and help the quality of life, and also do well, make profit in that process. But everything you do is going to have an aspect of benefit for others in it. And then think how you feel when you put your head down on the pillow. That's the policy that I'd like to see in my life. And I've been experimenting with this, and I have to tell you, it actually works.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Jonathan, Kehkashan, Monica, this is a conversation starter. We have lots more to go, but hopefully you enjoyed this hour with us today. I want to end with a quote, which I think is a nice segue from what Jonathan was just saying. Do not be dismayed by the brokenness of the world. All things break, and all things can be mended, not with time, as they say, but with intention. So go, love intentionally, love unconditionally. The broken world awaits in darkness for the light that you are. So thank you all so much for joining, and wishing you a beautiful rest of your day. Happy Earth Day, happy Earth everything, and take care.
Bye.
Thank you so much. This was great. Thank you,
Thank you.
Jonathan, Kehkashan, Sierra.
Thank you.
Wow.